Well, good afternoon. I think most of our registered participants have already entered the webinar. My name is Isabel Casasús. I'm the president of the EEAP, the European Federation of Animal Science. And I would like to welcome you all to this webinar, which is the first of the new EEAP webinar series that we are starting today. As you probably know, the EEAP is an organization devoted to the promotion of the research and dissemination of animal science amongst the scientific community, academia, the livestock sector, and also the civil society. We offer several services to our members, among which the annual meetings, technical workshops, and several publications that target a global audience. And we have been offering this, adapting to new changing times during our 70 years of history. However, over the past year, COVID-19 has caused an unprecedented change in the way we work, because we've had to adapt the way we do things to a very different way of working, conducting our day-to-day work, collaborating with our partners and sharing our results and so on. So most of our activities have moved online, which has been quite challenging, especially at the beginning when we were not so proficient in the use of all these platforms. We know it's difficult to compete with the personal interaction that we can have on on-site meetings, but we also see that there are great opportunities in online exchange. We could confirm that in our recent annual meeting, which was virtual, and we had there more than 1,400 participants presenting and discussing their research results. We had more than 1,000 presentations that were displayed at an online conference platform over 4 days, which was quite a challenge, but we were very satisfied with the results. And I have to announce that we have just closed the abstract presentation deadline for the annual meeting that we will have this year, and we have almost 1,100 abstracts that have been sent again for the meeting this year. These online events that we can offer now are quite attractive because they are easy to attend. There's no travel involved. We can have a global audience and panels of speakers. And also we think that a high level of interaction can be reached if we use the adequate tools. And besides, if we have the recorded versions, we can watch them after the event, and they provide a high quality material for online teaching and training. So for all these reasons, we wanted from EEAP to take this opportunity to deliver the series of webinars that we are starting today, which are open both to EEAP members and to non-members. Our objective is to offer monthly webinars with hot topics regarding animal science, where we will invite top speakers to present their latest research and views on the matter. You will be able to follow up on our next webinars at the EEAP webpage, where you will also have the recorded versions of the previous ones. We can already advance that we have after this seminar, we will have the next one on March the 21st, and it has already a very interesting program prepared by the EEAP Insect Scientific Commission on the growing sector of insects used as animal feed. So I encourage you to regularly check our webinar site at eap.org for updates. Today, we have chosen a topic which has been around us for more than a year now, which is the impact of COVID on the livestock sector, on livestock farming. This has caused, as we said, an unprecedented change, quite a tremendous disruption on agriculture, and we have had to adapt at very different levels of the food supply chain. We have to say that the livestock sector reacted quite quickly because both farmers and the industry made a great effort, especially during the first lockdowns, to keep their business as usual or as close as possible to that and ensure the supply of food to the markets in the short term. And for that, they have been widely acknowledged by society. However, we can now appreciate the many other consequences that COVID has had and is having on the long run which has only added to other challenges the livestock sector was already facing. And in this context, research and innovation will be essential to help the livestock sector be prepared for the different current and potential scenarios that the new normal, whatever it is, will bring. So different disciplines need to be mobilized in order to build a roadmap for a sustainable livestock sector that can guarantee food security and at the same time protect animal, human, and environmental health. To address all these topics, we have prepared quite an interesting program today, and we have 4 excellent speakers that will address the different topics of the impacts of COVID-19 on the livestock sector. First, we will have Martin Scholten from Wageningen University and Research, who will analyze the impact of COVID on animal research and funding policies. Then we will have Christiane Gortaza from the University of Castilla-La Mancha in Spain, who will deal with its impacts on animal health and farming. We will have a small comfort break, and thereafter, Laura Boyle from Chigas in Ireland will address the effects it's had on humans, animals, and environmental health in what is called the One Welfare approach. And finally, Michael Lee from Harper Adams University will analyze the impact it's had on the food supply chain and on the sustainability of livestock farming systems. And before we start with the presentations, I'd like to remind you some basic housekeeping rules. Please remember that this webinar is being recorded and it will be shared at eap.org. And please keep your cameras off and microphones muted during the presentations. If you have questions, you can type them into the chat box that you can see on your screen. Please identify yourself and the speaker you are addressing your question to, and we will select these questions to be answered during the questions and answer time after each presentation or during the general discussion at the end of the webinar. We can either select the questions from the chat, and you can also raise your hand for live questions during the questions and answer time. And finally, in the next days, you will receive a certificate of attendance and also a questionnaire to provide us feedback on how you find this webinar and what we can do to improve the next webinars we are going to offer. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our first speaker, who is Martin Scholten from Wageningen University and Research. Martin is currently a principal advisor for science diplomacy to future food and nature policies at Wageningen University and Research in the Netherlands. And he's involved with issues as biocircularity in agriculture, feeding the world within the planet's carrying capacity, and zoonotic emergency preparedness. He is also an advisor to the Dutch government on the connections among agriculture, nature, and food. And he is also active in many European and global networks. For example, he has been the president of the Livestock Innovation Platform Animal Task Force. He is co-chair of the Global Research Alliance on Agriculture Greenhouse Gases, and he's very well known to us in EEAP, where he has served as council member for some years. We are particularly grateful to Martin because for being with us today, because he had another commitment and he has made a great effort to attend both events. So thanks very much, Martin. However, this also means that he won't be able to join us at the final discussion that we will have at the end of this webinar. So please ask your questions directly into the chat box, and he will answer them after his talk. So thanks very much, Martin, and please take the stage.
Thank you very much, Isabel. Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. It is really a privilege for me to be the first speaker in the first COVID-proof webinar in the tradition of EEAP. So, yeah, that is really Great. Technically, hopefully you see my PowerPoint.
Perfect.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, EEAP, to give me and to invite me as a speaker in this webinar. It's my task for you to give an insight in the expected impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on animal research funding. And of course, in the European perspective. So that means from the Green Deal ambition with the farm to fork strategy, but also from in the light of the Horizon Europe, the new framework program. Almost a year ago, I chaired a task force in Wageningen University and Research to give an idea how COVID might change our world. The task force was named "The World After the Curve." And yeah, the COVID is a big disruption, a worldwide disruption. Like what we had foreseen a year ago, it has big implications on the politics, on the economics, on the business, consumers and citizens, on digitalization, employment, mobility, higher education, research, technology, development and innovation funding. It's all there. It's our world, because when it impacts politics, it also impacts the research funding. The same holds when it's impacting the business. Starting the analysis was with the expected first order consequences for research. What can you expect from the research part? Well, actually, we expected a reduction of the public budget for universities and research institutes to compensate the expenses related to the COVID recovery, but also a stronger focus on scientific supported policies and society instead of curiosity-driven and industry-driven sciences. We thought that European funding will shift towards more focus on preparedness, digitalization, and self-sufficiency in the European economy. Also less funding for international institutions and programs due to lower donorship and fewer charities. And last but not least, a lower co-funding from private parties. And actually, that's what we expected, and we see this happening. Not only the direct consequences for research in general are important to consider, but also the economic consequences for animal production. Because that's the world in which we are acting. That's our domain. We see that the European food system and single markets are relatively resilient, but and that short chains and supermarkets are good in business. But food services and HoReCa-related retail market are under pressure, and the economic recession results already in reduced prices for meat and dairy. Farmers' interest deviates more and more from agribusiness interests in the wake of the COVID. The policies responding to this kind of crisis is the European crisis policies. Actually, the European Commission has a three-layer crisis policy framework for that response, depending on the duration of the crisis and the severity of the crisis. We can foresee that the European Commission comes first of all on the short term with public and private interventions. You see, it happens now. But it might also come to a second stage on the medium term with farmer cash flow support. And finally, it can result in restructuring of the production on the longer term. It depends on how the COVID crisis will develop. And on the left-hand side of this slide, you see a graph with a forecast that we made a year ago about the financial impact of the COVID-19 aftermath in our business, in our domain. and you see that we are still on the green line, which is almost happening, but we can expect at the end of this year, end of 2021, if the tipping point, whether the crisis will recover, the financial impact will recover, the green line, or that the crisis will be more deep and more severe and more long-lasting, the orange line. So it will be very, very tricky to see what happens by the end of the year 2021. To translate this in possible scenarios of what can we expect of the future due to the COVID-19 pandemic, my colleague Krijn Poppe, agricultural economist at Wageningen University and research, did this scenario study. And what you see is that actually there are 4 options. You have the option that the role of the state, the role of the government, the role of the European Commission will not change, and the behavior will not change. Yeah, then we will stay in the business as usual. But it only can be done, of course, if the economic recovery is going along with that. There are people that are believing in the business recovery in a free global market after the COVID crisis. But more and more it becomes apparent that there are 2 other scenarios possible. One is more control by the government, preventive governmental control, or that the behavior of citizens, consumers, farmers, business goes into the direction of more healthier and more sustainable, a more greener society in the future, organized not in the global market, but in regional communities. The adaptive approach based on resilience is there the key word, the capacity of complex systems to deal with change and continue to develop. But some people dream, others are fearing that it might also be an end situation where we really come into a transformative situation, that this will mean flipping the switch towards a radical transition towards a smart green agriculture in Europe, the green high-tech transformation, so-called. What does that mean for the second order consequences, and then especially for animal research? I would say these consequences are more opportunities for animal research than threats for animal research. In the line of preparedness, we see that the interest in pandemic emergency preparedness and intervention and preventive health and lifestyle and food quality and authenticity are rising stars. The same holds for the resilience with more regionality of supply chains, climate smart land use, fostering biodiversity, and also here resilience by food in diversity and quality and authenticity. And you can also see that there is more interest in digitalization and high technology-driven, data-driven solutions with artificial intelligence in animal production. I think these are the key elements of the agenda for animal research in the coming years. And I come to that later back again. First of all, let's go in more detail for the preventive part. No pandemic again is the adagium, but there will be new emerging infectious diseases after the COVID. And over 70% of the emerging infectious diseases are in humans are zoonotic from origin. how can we be better prepared for an inevitable future pandemic? And here is the ERAS approach as an example: early recognition, rapid action to zoonotic emergencies. And it is a kind of circle from prevention to preparedness to response to recovery and learning to prevention, preparedness, response, recovery and learning, etc., etc. The pandemic prevention is about in-depth knowledge about emerging pathogens and global agri-food systems, but it also is in-depth knowledge about the agri-food system redesign, wildlife management and biodiversity recovery in connection to that, and mapping the hotspots. Pandemic preparedness, secondly, in this chain, is about surveillance and action, early warning, rapid characterization of pathogens, vaccine platforms that are ready to develop when a new pathogen is being characterized and is being seen, all based in contingency planning. The pandemic response management has to deal with successful outbreak control. It's a little bit further away from the domain of animal research per se. It is about interventions, diagnostics, community strategies, and data collection. But in the recovery and learning, the last step of the 4 in the circle, actually the first step in the circle, in the new circle, the next circle, is to learn from what happened. And the COVID-19 is for sure a showcase for research to understand more better the importance, the strength of agri-food system resilience. Are we good enough in our One Health approach? Comes later also in this seminar, this webinar, I have to say. The next one is this one. In resilience, actually, we can say resilience is circularity is trend setting. But circularity also comes along with resilience, and I will try to exemplify that. The main driver for future sustainability in food production is a shift in focus from only production efficiency to a balance with resource efficiency, by nature-based resource efficiency according to the principles of circularity, in a food system that's optimally embedded in a nature-based society. It's this point. So this was the food system as it was, and this is the food system of the future, also considered by the From Farm to Fork strategy. The use, the reuse of residuals in the food system, in the bio-based society, as resourcing of the food system itself. And there it comes. Livestock is connecting the circular resources by nature. Livestock can convert a much wider spectrum of non-food biomass as feed into food. The production of manure, high quality manure, processing the manure to a high quality gives an alternative for inorganic fertilization. And actually the carbon sequestration comes along with that, and the biodiversity restoration comes along with that. Livestock in the food system is really needed to come up with resilient food systems. And in the pandemic situation as we experience now, we have seen how important a resilient food system is, how important circular circularity in that food system is. Actually, I'm quite proud to be leading a consortium of 20 living labs where restoring the biodiversity and ecosystem services in agricultural landscape throughout across Europe is really there for real for impact. But in all these living labs, the livestock production is part of the story, and actually the livestock of the future is being characterized, will be characterized by a smart approach, adaptive, eco-technological livestock diversity to adapt to the local circumstances, diversity to increase the resilience, livestock to make sure that there is no waste in the food system, and that livestock as champions of recycling are part of that. But this means a more smart deviation, diversification of livestock, and that also comes along with research questions. Actually, this is already my last slide, so I think we have time for a good question and answer session. When I look at the Horizon Europe call that's just been launched for the call 2021 and 2022, you already see in that Horizon Europe call impact of the pandemic preparedness, from pandemic preparedness up to the role of biodiversity and ecosystem services in preventing pandemics and epidemic risks, and up to animal disease ecology to understand it better. But also the resilience has a prominent role in this call, with resilient livestock systems and the climate change and animal welfare 2.0. But also the microbiomes in the food production system, and the microbiome of livestock is one of the most important microbiomes in the food production system. And the agroecological approaches for resilient production and enhanced biodiversity. And also the smart part, the digitalization as an enabler for agroecological farming systems. I think this is not the same as the animal research that we know from the 7th Framework Program, that we know from the Horizon 2020 program. Probably we already have seen it a little bit in the Green Deal call in this year, 2020. But this will be the main challenges for animal science, for animal research in the COVID aftermath. The COVID will be reflected in the research agenda as well. So it's not impacting only our life, our society, our economy, but also our daily work as animal scientists, as animal researchers. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Martin. That was a very, very interesting talk. I think you have highlighted the role the livestock sector can have in helping the world recover from the pandemic, but they are also facing, as you said, many other challenges. And I think most of these programs are addressing, if not in these first calls, maybe on some topics later, they will address many issues concerned with the pandemic and preparedness. I think what COVID-19 has certainly demonstrated was that science and international collaboration were essential for giving a response for treatments, vaccines, and so on. And it's also true that it will be the core of the response in the livestock sector. The discussion is open if someone from the audience has any question. If that's not the case, Martin, well, we have seen that well, the Green Deal was already almost there when the outbreak of COVID-19 happened. But what's your perception? Can you elaborate on the kind of topics that you have seen change in response to what has happened in the past year from what was expected, that would be the first course to be launched.
Yeah, I think what I see is that more and more the direction is towards a livestock production that is part of a European food system to use the European resources for the food system, and also to provide European products for the European market. I think there is a tendency to become less globalized in the agri-food business. So I think that's an important point. And there you see the deviation of the interest for farmers and agribusiness. Actually, the agribusiness, the big agribusiness is global operating, is operating globally, while the farmers are more and more marginalized in the global economy, and find its room in a more regional European economy with specific products. Also, the society asks farmers to come up with more adaptive farm systems, customized to the diversity that the European landscape brings. And I see that reflected in the research agenda. Actually, the Green Deal call was already launched before the COVID came there. But very soon you saw the impact of the COVID in paying more attention to the preparedness of pandemics. Where comes the viruses are coming from wildlife? You need animal researchers to understand that, to know that, to track that, to trace that. But also more locally connected, more diverse food system, also compared with animal production, is really less sensitive for pandemic risks, also not creating pandemic risks, zoonotic risks. So the tendency is towards there, both from the society, from policy, and I see it from farmer side. And I see that the agribusiness will follow this change in the market. But it is really a disruption, and I don't think the Horizon Europe will ever go back to the pre-COVID period. It will always have this lessons learned from the COVID as the guiding principles for setting up the next research agenda.
Well, it will be very good if we had learned something from this. And well, I think the approach is the typical think global and not local. More and more, the projects mobilize different disciplines, and they want to have different regions involved, different agroecosystems, different farming systems, and analyze how different responses can be delivered in each situation. Yeah. So I think we have a question here.
Yeah, I see.
It's from Mohammed Abubakar.
Yeah, I saw the question of so the question of Mohammed having taken a cursory look at happenings globally in your own perspective, what do you think livestock sector needs to do to sustain its livestock value chains in this regard? Well, actually, I think what is necessary for both the livestock sector as well as for the livestock scientists, the animal scientists, is to stress the importance of animals in a nature-based food system, in a circular food system, in a food system that works with in compliance with the capacity of our planet. When we look at the natural ecosystems, there is no ecosystem without animals. animals are there to make sure that the cycle is closed. The circle of life is closed only by animals. That's in real life nature. That is also in the nature of the food systems, and it's by nature of our livestock species that are the champions in recycling, even when it's the ruminants, the cattle, the goats, the sheep, but also the chickens and the pigs that are originally there to cope with the resources locally available. So I think we have to change from defending the opposition against livestock production with all kind of arguments that it is not so bad as it is, but that we offense, that we bring the positive story of livestock and repeat and repeat again that livestock is in the heart of a sustainable food system, and that is a food system that is without livestock is an amputated food system, which is not as sustainable, not as efficient, not as resilient as a livestock system with as a food system with livestock. And I think that is an important message, and also to prove it in practice, to demonstrate it in experiments, and to convince the society not to make the wrong choice. Linear reduction of the number of animals will not end up in sustainability, but a transformative change of how we are using our animals. Yeah, that's a point we can take up. The animal production as we have now built up over the last 60 years can be changed. We can be much more making use of filling the circularity gap by selection of other feeds and by better management of the manure.
Thanks, Martin. We have a question, well, it's on the same line from Jan Ledoux, who says that it's good to see you put livestock at the heart of the agricultural systems, but do you see this continuing in spite of the increasing pressure of the implied greenhouse gas emissions associated to ruminants?
Yeah, very good. I just had a discussion this morning with VP Climate about this point, where we agreed to that there is a lot to gain with mitigation options, better feed, better breed, etc., etc. But there is an end on the story. What we can do with direct mitigation. But circularity in the food system is really the next gain. Is the missing step between what we can reduce from a technical point of view to climate neutrality. That means that most of the emissions are related to residuals, to waste, to emissions are parts of what is wasted. The closer, the more smart we can connect the food system, elements in the food system by circularity, the lower the emissions of greenhouse gases will be, or actually better to say, the more carbon is being sequestered in an agroecological ecosystem, and yeah, the animals are needed for that. I have a very nice graph showing that we only can come to that carbon neutrality when we are using animal manure, when we are using byproducts from croplands to feed animals, when we are using our biomass residuals to feed either the soils or the animals, and yeah, that's so great. So yeah, ruminants produce methane. but the capacity to provide ecosystem services to enhance the carbon sequestration can balance that out. And we have to look at a system, not just at one part of the total food system in a single production line.
And we have time for a final question from Melanie Giovanni, who asks if you foresee that there will be a kind of unglobalization for livestock farming and a more intense focus in local markets, and how can this system be financially viable?
Yeah, with another business model than the business model based on global trade of commodities. Actually, that's the story. The business on commodities is already marginal for farmers, for the direct agribusiness. It's profitable for retailers, very close to the consumers, but it is not in the production, in the upstream part of the food system. When you can cope with a wider spectrum of resources, the expenses to gather resources, the expenses to feed your animals will be lower. When you're producing byproducts, that is resourcing for others, for instance, manure as fertilizer, is providing extra income. So the economic model has to be more scarce on what your a wider range of resources, makes you less dependent on a scarce resource that everybody use, so makes you able to cope with less expensive resources. And the more, the wider your production is, not only the single commodity, but also byproducts, the better your business is filled with that. So no waste means also no waste of money in the farming system. So also that point, it's often said there is no earning in it. Yeah, there is an earning, but you have to bring it in practice, and you have to find another position in the market, more in the regional market. I'm not saying local to local. It's not per se local to local. If you can do it, then it's fine. But as close by as possible, as far away as necessary, also from an economic point of view, but try to find it in an economic food system that you oversee, and that's not depending on the competitive rules of the global market and trade.
That's a very interesting point of view. Thank you. So, Martin, we won't occupy more of your time. So we thank you very much for being able to be with us today, despite the busy afternoon that we know you have. Thanks very much for a very interesting talk, and hope to see you soon around.
Okay, thank you, Isabel.
Thank you.
And goodbye, and thank you all.
Now we will move to our next speaker, who is Christiane Gortaza from the University of Castilla-La Mancha in Spain. Christiane is a veterinary with interest in ecology, and he works in the National Wildlife Research Institute, EEAP, where they deal with the conservation and management of wildlife in their habitats. His expertise in wildlife epidemiology and disease control has resulted in a large number of grants and scientific publications, as well as his participation in several teaching and mentoring programs. Christiane's research interests include viral, bacterial, and parasitic diseases of wildlife and their interaction with livestock. And he has an emphasis on zoonotic diseases such as tuberculosis, which is very important also in the case of livestock production. So we will have now Christiane's talk. Oops, sorry. And
Hi everybody, this is Christiane Gortaza from the EEAP Institute, Universidad de Castilla-La Mancha in Spain, and I'm going to present on the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on animal health and farming. And this is the presentation outline. I will start with some context on animals and coronaviruses, and then deal with the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on animal health. And finally end up with some outlook on what we can learn from other animal health crises and what is going to happen, how long will it take to quit the pandemic. Coronaviruses mostly evolved in bats, and bats have a huge diversity of species. And also coronaviruses have a diversity of forms. There are alpha, beta, gamma, and so on coronaviruses. The ones that we are more interested right now because of SARS is, of course, the beta coronaviruses. And in fact, you can see there are links between coronaviruses found in bats and coronaviruses found in human beings, and most likely there are also other mammalian species involved as what we would call bridge hosts. How does it happen that coronaviruses jump over from their natural circulation in bat populations to domestic animals or eventually to human beings? Well, essentially because we are getting closer together. For different reasons, we are increasing the probability of contact between bats, animals, and humans, and eventually this creates the right environment for host jumps to happen. And in fact, these kind of events have happened historically quite often. It is estimated with molecular clock analysis that one human coronavirus already emerged in the year 1200, and there were other cases of emergence in 1700, in the 19th century, and several of them also during the 20th century. In the current century, since the year 2000, there have been three relevant events. SARS coronavirus emerged in 2002, SARS-1, and this happened in China and was mediated by a carnivorous mammal, probably the palm civet. In 2012, there was the emergence of MERS coronavirus, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus. This originated also from bats, but was mediated by a different bridge host, in this case, the dromedary camel. And, as you all know, quite recently, in 2019, SARS coronavirus 2 emerged, in this case in another part of China, spreading globally and originating the COVID-19 pandemic. And the rest of the story, you know it. So essentially, this pandemic originated from a host jump that came from a bat, probably of the genus Rhinolophus, and most likely there was some mammalian bridge host involved. However, this bridge host is still unknown. And this infection, unfortunately, spread, once it jumped into the human population, it spread globally. Now, what is the effect of this pandemic on animal farming? Well, obviously it had effects on all aspects you can imagine, and one of them is animal transport and the production input availability. Even in some countries, meat processing plants had to be shut down because of the frequent transmission events in these cold and closed environments. And this created a huge pressure on the pig and poultry industries. Also, there have been effects on animal care and welfare because of the lockdown, because of the sanitary rules, and so on. And these aspects will be presented in other parts of this webinar. I am dealing in this one with the animal health aspect. And the animal health aspect will cover both the short-term and the long-term effects. What is the effect of COVID-19 on animal health? Well, first of all, there are several drivers. On one side, there is the immediate driver, which is human confinement and inactivity. This has some effect on animal populations, and this may have an effect on animal health. On the other side, there are long-term drivers that we are still suffering and will keep on suffering for a number of years, unfortunately. And this is mainly the economic crisis. And these drivers have their consequences. And the consequences are, on one side, implications of coronavirus infections for farm animals. On the other side, there is less control of endemic diseases. And there may also be a weaker response to new and emerging diseases. So you can see the impact is a multifaceted one. So, if we take one disease as an example, in this case bovine tuberculosis, we may find both short-term and long-term effects. Regarding the short-term effects, the effects of the lockdown and the lower presence of people in the environment, so to say, this has consequences like having more wildlife on farm premises and, more importantly, a consequence in form of an interruption of TB testing, or at least a relaxation of TB testing. And of course, both are driving risks towards eventually finding more TB breakdowns. The main effect, however, is to be expected in the long term, and this one is because of the economic crisis. This will mean less resources for TB testing. It also will mean insufficient wildlife reservoir control, because this is also resource dependent. There will be possibly less investment in farm biosafety, and there may be even lower vaccine coverage and parasite control, and so a poorer health status of the animals. By different mechanisms, at the end you get to the same outcome, which is more TB breakdowns. Well, this is just a supposed pathway of possible consequences and possible mechanisms intervening regarding animal health and COVID-19. However, some of these discussions are already visible. For instance, there are a couple of papers in the veterinary record stating that there are some challenges for keeping the appropriate social distance while TB testing, particularly in young cattle, and therefore it has been established that calves under a certain age can eventually not be tested in order to keep on with the rules of COVID-19 social distancing. So you see there starts to be some. Unfortunately, in the case of TB, there is experience from a previous crisis, foot and mouth disease. When foot and mouth disease occurred in the UK in 2001, it had a huge effect on TB control. This was because of the draining of all the veterinary capacities to foot and mouth control, and therefore relaxing, obviously, the control of TB, of the ongoing endemic disease TB. And you can see there between the red lines that the number of tests went down spectacularly during foot and mouth, and then after foot and mouth in the upper graph, you see there was a tremendous jump in the number of new herd incidents. So a crisis, in that case, an animal disease crisis, nothing to do with tuberculosis, caused a change in tuberculosis epidemiology because of the effects on TB testing. Another example is emerging and transboundary diseases. For instance, there is now an international effort ongoing to control and to try to eradicate peste de petit ruminant. This is a morbillivirus that is present in many parts of the world, including many areas of Africa. However, one of the problems in the fight against PPR is precisely the COVID-19 pandemic, as stated in a recent report by FAO. And it is not only PPR, it is also other emerging diseases like lumpy skin disease. This seems to be expanding, and in part, this seems to be due to the economic effect of the COVID-19 pandemic. Also, regarding human emerging diseases, it happens that in 2020 there was a re-emergence of MERS in Saudi Arabia, infecting 18 people with 5 deaths. And this went rather unnoticed due to the global COVID-19 crisis. There are also some positive news. For instance, in Japan, a new assessment on the risk of ASF introduction, African swine fever introduction, calculated that due to reduced travel and the associated risks, there was a lower risk of ASF introduction into Japan. Now let's have a look at the animals themselves, at farmed animals. The worst case scenario is the one affecting mink. In the case of mink, you can see there are jumps from humans to mink, from mink back to humans. And this is an exceptional situation that is not repeating itself for the moment with any other animal species. As a consequence, mink farming is going to be stopped in some countries, like for instance the Netherlands and Denmark. Now the important point is that when the virus jumps from one host, in this case from a human host to an animal host and back to the human host, the virus will change because of adaptation. And some of these changes may eventually be more successful and may become one of those variants of concern. Fortunately, this was not the case in the mink farming event, but it may eventually happen in the future in any other similar situation. Also, other mustelids, notably ferrets, can be found infected. However, their lower population size means that the risks associated with mutation is generally lower than in the case of mink. But what about other farm animals? Cattle do get infected, but fortunately do not transmit the virus to in-contact animals. Pigs seem not susceptible. However, we know nothing about sheep and goat, And we know that rabbits do get infected. And always in this field, you need to expect the unexpected. In this experiment that is still not formally published, but available already as a preprint by colleagues from the USDA, you can see that they infected white-tailed deer, a cervid species. And the interesting point is that they managed to show that there was transmission from deer to deer. So eventually, deer, like mink, may maintain virus circulation in their populations, at least under the conditions of this specific trial. Another long-term potential consequence of COVID-19 on animal health and animal production is a more far-reaching one. It is known that the emergence of pathogens has to do with interspecies contact, and this interspecies contact is essentially mediated by large-scale changes in climate, in land use, and very especially in animal management. Therefore, there is this other kind of effect that may be due to change in the public attitudes towards livestock production and wildlife use. Now, coming slowly to the end of the presentation, I think there are lots of aspects where we can learn from veterinary science. For instance, from the success of rinderpest eradication, where there was a combination of research efforts in vaccine development and in epidemiology, including the development of a thermostable vaccine, but then there was also an application of participatory epidemiological techniques allowing vets to interact with the cattle herders to effectively target the control measures. So not only knowing what works, but also being able to transmit it and to apply it appropriately. When I see this, I think, for instance, of the long discussion on aerosol transmission of SARS coronavirus 2. There are more things that we can learn from veterinary science. For instance, back to the foot and mouth disease. There are many things like preclinical viral transmission, early detection, lockdowns, biosecurity, shortage of testing capacity, and so on, that are in common with some of the problems that we faced as a population with COVID-19. For instance, choosing some of the lessons to be learned, I would particularly point at ensuring that outbreaks do not become epidemics, including the need to consider national lockdown. This was already discussed after the foot and mouth disease crisis in the UK. There is also the point of the need for rapid testing and reporting, including point-of-care tests. And in many European countries, point-of-care tests, particularly antigen tests, are still not freely available for the public. Also, there was a point that scientific experts must be accountable not only to government ministers, but also to other experts. And this reminds me very much of the discussions we had in Spain regarding the fake scientific committee advising the government during the COVID-19 crisis. More things we can learn. We can look into coronaviruses in animals. For instance, into the porcine epidemic diarrhea virus, a coronavirus that is emerging and re-emerging, and that traveled from one point to the other of the world, that mutated and changed and then went back to the origin, and so on. We can even learn from chicken, because in chicken, coronaviruses are one of the big problems in animal production, and things like lockdowns, movement controls, vaccination are usual tools for the veterinary sector. And even more can we learn from veterinary science. For instance, there is a lot of background on using vaccines against coronaviruses in dogs, in cats, in bovines, in swine, and in birds. And there have been many different routes of administration, vaccine types, and so on. All this gives relevant information that is not always properly used in the context of the pandemic. So now to the final point. How long will this pandemic still last? Well, we don't know, but you are all aware of what is happening in Brazil, especially in Manaus, where 70% of the population had already antibodies or had had contact with the virus. So there was, in principle, a herd immunity level. And then a new lineage, a new variant emerged and essentially provoked a second wave that was even harder than the first one. This is obviously a game changer. And even if you look globally, we were happy enough to see during 6 weeks in a row a decline globally in the number of cases of new cases of COVID-19. However, the trend has changed. And after 6 weeks declining, in the last week where there are data, the trend has reversed already. And this reversal of the trend has probably to do with the more transmissible new variants. What is happening? Well, essentially, with our social distancing, confinement, masks, and so on, natural selection will make it that the more transmissible viruses will survive best and will multiply. Then we use vaccines and we target herd immunity. But then again, natural selection will select for variants that are able to escape antigenically. What can we do then? Well, we need a very good surveillance, monitoring, including sequencing. We need to improve detection, more accessible antigen tests. We need to reduce transmission, especially taking care of aerosols and quality masks. And we need to work on vaccination, of course. And we need probably to learn to live with the virus. So is this going to stay for long? We don't know, but my guess is it will become endemic, despite vaccines, because of virus variants of concern, and maybe also because of animal reservoirs. And there we come back to the aspects of animal health and their relevance in the whole context of COVID-19. And with this, I'm almost finishing the presentation with the following 3 take-home messages. First one, global change and pathogen spread are going to carry on. We don't know which is the next pandemic and when it will happen, but we can be absolutely sure it will happen, and it will most likely come from the animal world. Therefore, it seems clever to involve vets and animal specialists in the fight against emerging infections, not just against COVID-19, but against emerging infections in general. And on the practical side, and taking into account we are entering a long economic crisis because of this pandemic, we urgently need to adapt animal health management strategies both at the farm level and at the national and international one, to the available resources. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Christian. It was a very challenging talk. Thanks for highlighting the very important role of the interface between wildlife, livestock, and humans, and also for highlighting the lessons we can learn from the veterinary expertise on epidemiology. I think it's what you have said today is very important and could be very helpful. Before we have some questions on the chat, if someone wants to pose a question, I'd like to know, are you aware of any surveillance system that has been established either at a national or a transnational level to assess the infections of COVID on wildlife? Because we have seen that it can affect mink and even rabbits, and we don't know if it can affect sheep and goat. But if it can affect these animals, it can certainly affect other mustelids or other wild mammals, and they could be the breech host that you said was missing. Are you aware of any kind of system for surveilling this?
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Isabel, and the whole organization for inviting me to give this presentation. And regarding surveillance in animals, I guess there are two situations: the academic research one and the government more formal one. Okay, regarding the academic one, I guess everybody in the big groups is now looking at animals just in case, because whatever comes out is very relevant, is very interesting, and this is at the very edge of what we know. But on the formal, more official side, the only group of animals that is currently of concern is farm mink and other farm mustelids, because they have very large populations, and because there is the only situation where it has been shown that the virus can enter from human beings, obviously, circulate, and eventually turn back to humans, eventually changing on the way. And this is, of course, a risk, because there may be that may be a mechanism for the emergence of new variants or whatsoever. In other mustelids, including wildlife, there is a recommendation to pay attention to them, to investigate, but it is pretty unlikely to find something that is very relevant, because mustelids do not form large populations that would allow the circulation of the virus. I would be more interested in other situations of other wildlife that may have larger populations, where eventually something of interest might happen. But I think this part is staying for the moment more on the research side of things rather than on the official one.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And you have also presented some ideas that we could extract for the experience that we veterinarians have had with other diseases, but also with coronaviruses. We have seen, well, you have illustrated how the different diseases, either classical or re-emerging, are interconnected, and how they are affected by COVID-19, if not directly, because it doesn't directly affect the animals, because of the reduced resources to the control of these diseases. But could you elaborate on some other things that could be extracted from the veterinary experience? I mean, we have been vaccinating our animals against coronavirus for a long time, and we know that immunity regarding coronavirus is not easy to handle. Do you think we can learn something for the future vaccines, which obviously are very different from those we are using in animals, in livestock?
That's a long question with a lot of different angles. In a very broad sense, I would say that as vets, and particularly as people working in the field of livestock breeding and animal science, we are very used to deal with populations and to handle the disease at the population scale. Therefore, we are pretty used to things like biosafety, like confinement, like movement control, obviously like mass vaccination, mass testing, all these kind of tools that are now on the table because of COVID-19. And I have the impression that in some cases, the national health services, at least in certain countries and certainly here in Spain, were no longer used to deal with population dynamics and epidemiology at the population scale. They were more used to the individual medicine approach, which is fine, of course, but the epidemiology side has shown a strong weakness. And in this aspect is where I think that authorities should have taken more advantage of the existing knowledge in the veterinary field. And then, well, there are so many other specific aspects where things could be done, and research is certainly needed, but that's too broad probably for a short answer here.
So thanks. If anyone wants to ask a question, please. If that's not the case, we'll have a short break now, and we will come back at, I think it will be 3:30, and we will follow with our webinar. We have now a couple of presentations left, and then we will have a general discussion. So please come back with us at 3:30. And in the meanwhile, I'm gonna share with you not only the program of today's webinar, but also the one that we will have at the end of March. Oh, sorry, which is this one that has been prepared by the EEAP Insect Scientific Commission. So please come back in a quarter of an hour, and we'll go on with this webinar on the impacts of COVID-19 of livestock. Thank you very much. Well, we are back again with our EAP webinar on the effects of COVID-19 on the livestock sector. And thanks for being back with us. Our next speaker will be Laura Boyle. Laura is a senior researcher at TIGASC in Ireland, and she is an expert in farm animal behavior and welfare science. Laura is also a member of the European College of Animal Welfare and Behavioral Medicine, and a recognized advisor for the European Food Safety Authority, and also for several national Irish committees. She has a large scientific production and has participated in numerous farm animal welfare programs, most of the projects concerning the effects of housing and management practices on the welfare of dairy cows and pigs. Laura is also interested in the link between animal health and animal welfare, and in the contribution they can make to the sustainability of animal agriculture. In 2019, she was awarded by the British Society and Animal Science and the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals for her innovative developments in animal welfare. She is also a very active EAP member because she is the current chair of the Animal Behavior Working Group, and she has been secretary to our Animal Health and Welfare Scientific Commission. The title of Laura's presentation is The Impact of COVID-19 on Animal Health and Welfare. It's a one welfare issue. So we will now have Laura's presentation. If I can share my screen.
Thank you very much for the introduction. So let me introduce the topic by first exploring the prominent role that animals played in our lives during the past year. So I, like thousands of people across the world, adopted a dog early on into lockdown last year, and he brought us lots of love and fun, as I hope we brought into his life. However, the welfare of our pets was also adversely affected, firstly by the fact or the fear that our pets would make us sick with coronavirus, and this led to pets being abandoned. And of course, adopting a puppy is for life, not just for a pandemic. And lots of animals were, again, given up to shelter homes when the pandemic puppy didn't work out. There were other issues, such as an increase in dog bites because of the increased and prolonged proximity, I suppose, between children and pets in the home. And this has led to a huge surge in this and other issues have led to a huge surge in the number of relinquished and abandoned animals. This report is from American pet shelters. So coronavirus also had implications for wild and zoo animals. There were concerns that some endangered species like the mountain gorillas would become infected by coronavirus. And there were reports of zoo animals like the gorillas here in San Diego Zoo contracting coronavirus. There were fears for the welfare of zoo animals and other animals in captivity because of reduction in revenue during the pandemic. And there was fundraising for many zoos around the world. Some zoo animals benefited from the reduction in visitors because they showed behavioural changes and used more of their enclosures during this time. And of course, it seemed like the whole world was watching Tiger King from our own enclosures, and I think the lockdown helped us to empathise a little bit more with the plight of such animals. So obviously one of the animals that featured really highly all year has been bats, and this is because they were being sold in the wet markets in Wuhan for human consumption. And it is believed, well, one theory is that the wet markets launched the coronavirus. There's a lot of debate about this, a lot of conspiracy theories, but certainly there may have been some role here. And indeed, even in a very recent publication, SARS-CoV-2 was detected in bats as far away from China as caves down in Thailand. So we all know, of course, how poorly thought of bats are, and the fear and the misconceptions surrounding them. We only have to think of Dracula to know how badly represented they are and how maligned they are, if you like. So ecologists are fighting back to shift the blame from bats. There are many papers showing how anthropogenic-induced climate change has brought bats into closer contact with humans, therefore facilitating the transmission of disease. And to emphasize the insectivorous and therefore beneficial attributes of bats in pest control. So it's estimated they save US crops from about $3.6 billion worth of damage every year. So this has led authors like in this paper, Liu et al. To stress the importance of a One Health approach in enforcing public health guidelines. This is in relation to another zoonotic disease, rabies, but it could equally apply to coronavirus. So really what I wanted to do and what I've done in the past few slides is to emphasize how connected our mental and physical well-being is to animals and through animals to our environment. And this is really emphasized by what we all know as the One Health approach. And One Health is about the collaborative efforts of multiple disciplines working locally, nationally, and globally to attain optimal health for people, animals, and the environment. And I did a quick search on Google looking for the One Health and coronavirus together and found nearly 11,500 articles really advocating a One Health approach to this pandemic and to prevent future pandemics. So papers like this in the One Health journal. Of course, the topic of this talk is One Welfare, and One Welfare extends the concept of One Health to emphasize the interconnectedness of the welfare of humans, animals, and the environment in which they live, and is therefore, if you consider that health as a component of welfare, perhaps arguably a more holistic concept. But when I searched for One Welfare in conjunction with coronavirus or COVID-19 in Google Scholar, there were only about 140 articles. And so it is a much less well-known concept. And I'll just direct you to one very recent paper in Applied Animal Behavior Science about One Welfare if you want to read more about the concept and the framework in general. It's written by Rebecca Garcia, who is actually the founder of the One Welfare concept. So now let's move on to species and animals that are closer to all of us here, farmed animals. But I do want to start by talking about mink. So mink might not come to mind when we talk about farm animals, but there are 35 million of them farmed for fur in the EU. And I guess we'll all know that there were about 17 million mink culled in Denmark, but also in many other countries around Europe and the world. So if we talk about the mink cull in terms of One Welfare, then we had the fact that they were culled obviously because they posed a risk not only to human welfare but also to wildlife, so animals there. And of course, mink themselves died because of coronavirus. In the United States, so that more than 12,000 of the country's 3 million farmed mink actually died from coronavirus. And there were other issues surrounding the mink cull related to animal welfare. And there were fears that gassing is a cruel way to kill mink. This is a commonly held conception. Because they are semi-aquatic animals, they're able to hold their breath for long periods. Moving back to the welfare of humans and how the mink cull hit on human well-being, this picture shows mink farmers in Denmark lowering their flag to half-mast on the day that they had to kill 250,000 of their animals. So it was a huge psychological toll on people who lost their livelihoods and on the simple act of having to kill all those animals. Of course, killing them and disposal of the bodies posed a huge environmental threat, and in Denmark millions of mink were exhumed over pollution controls. So the mink cull really just is a nice example of how the One Welfare framework works. But for the next few slides, I want to focus on a paper that I wrote with Jeremy Marchant last year, where we looked at the effects on livestock production in terms of One Welfare, and we focused on pigs and poultry. So you'll all be very familiar with intensive pig and poultry production sectors, but obviously there are very few large farms with large numbers of animals. They're enclosed, climate controlled and automated, characterized usually by very few stock persons, but most importantly, they operate at maximal output or full capacity always. This means the immediate impact of any disruption is felt up and downstream. So let's look first of all at some of the short-term effects of COVID-19 on the supply chains. So there were many jokes going around about panic buying of toilet roll, but there were also panic buying of animal products such as eggs, cheese and milk. There was an increase in meals prepared at home and a reduction in meals eaten out. So there's two streams of supply of the food service industry versus supermarkets, and there was a huge readjustment in these two supply chains. Because of the closure of schools in the US, there was about a 12 to 15% reduction in demand for dairy, meaning that US dairy farmers had to dump milk as the pandemic upended food markets. But there was also milk dumping in other countries because of reduced processing capacity. The whole egg demand went up with the increase in people preparing foods at home, and the demand for liquid egg went down. And this led to the closure, indeed, of a liquid egg plant, which resulted in 61,000 chickens being euthanized in the US again. But it was really the COVID-19 outbreaks in meat plants that have featured very strongly all year, and that really have happened in almost every country in the world. But at the time of writing the paper, the time of publication of the paper in September, the US was definitely the worst hit country. At that stage, they'd had 40,000 cases in over 400 plants associated with 49 shutdowns. But as I said, there's hardly a country that's been untouched by this. Another industry was Tönnies in Germany that was ordered to shut after coronavirus outbreak later in the year. Last year was around July or August. And this headline comes from an Irish newspaper only a week or two ago, which was advocating shutdown of meat plants because of the ongoing outbreaks in such plants. So to counteract some of these shutdowns, the USDA issued line speed waivers. This was for the poultry plants, and it meant that there was an increase in the number of birds per minute on the line from 140 to 175 birds. And this has some implications in some of the slides I'm going to cover next. So let's talk a little bit about the outbreaks of COVID in the meat plants and the effects and the implications for human well-being. So obviously anyone who is sick with COVID, their health and welfare is down, and the people who contracted COVID in the meat plants were obviously sick and had poor welfare. But what these outbreaks really revealed were enormous inequality issues. So we know that in meat plants all around the world, they're mostly operated by migrant and minority workers. And such people are, outside of any occupation that they do, at greater risk of COVID. They have language barriers and poor working conditions because in most meat plants, it's food safety and zoonotic disease that dictates hygiene practices rather than the transfer of disease between humans. So all of these issues really place workers in meat plants at increased risk of coronavirus. And there are other complications associated with working in meat plants. There's a lot of animal equipment and assault-related injuries, psychological stress and drug use, and generally the people who work there are poorly paid, in some countries have poor health care and lack of sick leave, and they live in high density and low quality. So the plant workers obviously also face financial uncertainty and job losses, and their workloads and duties may have changed. So with people missing from the line and out sick, and people were put doing work perhaps that they weren't accustomed to, which could have also increased the injury and stress. But the plant shutdowns obviously also had implications for farmers because they suffered financial losses. We saw about the Mink farmers in Denmark in an earlier slide. And there's a huge cost associated with depopulation, which we already touched on. But even the euthanasia of single animals, individual animals on farms, is a major barrier towards the euthanasia of compromised or casualty animals. But when it comes to mass depopulation, and this picture comes from the foot and mouth crisis in the UK in the 90s, and we know that the people involved in this suffered years of distress and disorders following this depopulation. There are also threats to public health associated with food safety, and carcass disposal can cause pathogen release, pose odor and nuisance insects, which are all obviously cause problems for public health. Moving on then to the for farm animals. So this loss in processing capacity affected all species, and you can see this graph taken from the paper shows a reduction in processing capacity for poultry, cattle and pigs. But of course, the poultry and pig industries were more severely affected. So in April 2020 in the US, it was estimated that slaughter capacity was down to about 55% of normal. This meant that about 250,000 pigs were reaching slaughter weight every day without anywhere to go. So in April, President Trump did issue an executive order to reopen, and by May 19th, the plants were up to about 80% of capacity. But this still meant that there was about 100,000 pigs a day reaching slaughter weight without anywhere to kill them. In the poultry plants, the increased line speeds that I mentioned earlier did recapture some of the loss in capacity. So focusing for a little bit on poultry welfare then, these line speed waivers could result in incomplete stunning, which would obviously have negative implications for poultry welfare. So we know that broilers grow at very fast rates, which means they become overcrowded very quickly if there's nowhere for them to be slaughtered. And under high stocking densities, poultry suffer a lot of welfare problems, including reduced walking ability and leg health, increased fearfulness, foot pad dermatitis and mortality. There's also an increase in heat production, which would reduce air and bedding quality. One way of addressing this is to stop placing eggs for incubation, and this would have an effect on bird numbers within 3 weeks. Another option is to destroy eggs or kill chicks at hatching, which takes a little bit longer to adjust the numbers, perhaps about 2 months. But we know that there's already enormous welfare, ethical and societal concerns around the routine killing of day-old male chicks, and many countries have moved to ban this procedure. So these all have implications for welfare. When it comes to pigs, I suppose there is a little bit more resilience compared to the poultry chains, but they still grow very quickly and can become overcrowded very quickly. And at high stocking densities, you get a reduction in activity and comfort behavior and leg health, similar to poultry. Of course, with pigs, under high stocking densities, you get a huge increase in aggression, skin injuries, tail biting, and susceptibility to disease. A reduction in performance and increase also in heat production, and therefore reduction in air quality. Mitigation strategies in the US, where they feed growth promoters, they could remove them from the diet, and in a way this would have potential positives for pig welfare. Other countries designed holding diets, which are lower in energy and higher in fibre and have the effect of reducing feed intake. But this can affect the affective state of pigs by increasing the feelings of hunger, which would be associated with an increase in aggression. Another way is to simply reduce feed availability to pigs, but obviously this will make them hungry and likely to be more aggressive. Another method is to increase the temperature in the buildings, which will increase heat stress. And stopping breeding and inducing abortions, the latter would also have obviously ethical implications. So the worst case scenario is obviously where animals have to be killed en masse. And ideally this would be by euthanasia, whereby animals have a good death without pain or distress. At the very least, emergency killing should observe the same level of welfare as during slaughter. And this means minimal handling, immediate death, sedation followed by death, or death while unconscious or stunned. But really, this is very difficult to achieve at scale. And we'll all have seen some of the images from Asia where animals were buried alive in response to the African swine fever outbreaks. And this is obviously very distressing for the animals and the humans involved. So risks to animal welfare associated with handling, the stun kill quality, and confirmation of death disposal. So we don't know exactly, I don't know exactly as of today how many pigs have been killed in the US or around the world, but certainly as per September 2020, 600,000 pigs had been killed in Iowa State alone, and up to 10 million birds across the US had to be emergency killed. And the guidelines that would cover these emergency killings are in the US, the AVMA, in conjunction with the National Animal Health Emergency Management System. And in the EU, there were two recent scientific opinions published by EFSA, one on killing for purposes other than slaughter in poultry in 2019, and more recently, last year, in fact, in June, the welfare of killed pigs during killing for purposes other than slaughter. Excuse me. So the methods that were advocated then for pigs include electrical, mechanical, so that could be blunt trauma or captive bolt, gas mixtures, and lethal injection. Obviously, the chosen method depends on the size or age of the pig. The AVMA also include ventilation shutdown and ventilation shutdown plus heat or carbon dioxide, which is known as VSD+. In poultry, the methods of euthanasia or mass emergency killing depend on the production system, be it floor, cage, or aviary, and some of the methods include water-based foam, whole, partial, house, or containerized gassing, cervical dislocation, mechanically assisted cervical dislocation, decapitation, and captive bolt gun. The method of choice in the US was actually whole house gassing with water-based foam methods, and it should be noted that the OIE does not condone the use of water-based foam methods, even in emergency situations. So from the two EFSA reports, the implications for animal welfare of mass emergency killing, they identified 29 hazards to poultry and 28 to pigs, mostly related to the stun and kill quality, but also to lack of staff skills and training and poorly designed and constructed facilities. With poultry, there are fears about insufficient time of exposure, say, to the gases, and then this timing of ventilation shutdown. So ventilation shutdown, the pigs are supposed to be, or the poultry or pigs are supposed to be unconscious, and they're not supposed to die of thermal stress, but in fact, there are concerns that sometimes they do. We don't need to do too much research to imagine the potential negative impacts of all of these methods of disposal on animal welfare. But at minimum, they're likely to cause enormous pain, fear, impede movement, and also potential respiratory disease. Another area that was affected was animal transport. So anytime animal transportation time is increased, you're going to get an increase in transport stress. Where plants shut down and animals had to be moved longer distances to alternative slaughter plants, obviously they will then experience increased transport stress. But there were also restrictions in movement between countries. So when the new variant was detected, coronavirus variant was detected in the UK, a lot of countries shut their borders, and there were 7 and 8 hour tailbacks on the UK motorways and across the channel in France indeed, and it's not inconceivable that there were animals tied up in those backlogs. So Baptiste et al. Wrote about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the welfare of animals in Australia, and they outlined another interesting scenario that happened whereby the Al Kuwait livestock ship arrived in Western Australia with a lot of the crew sick, such that it couldn't load its stock of sheep and head away again. They had to wait till the crew recovered. And by the time they'd all recovered, they'd entered the month of June, and there is a northern summer order, which is that animals cannot be transported during the summer because of the potential for heat stress. but the Australian government revoked this order and allowed the ship to carry its stock of 50,000 sheep. And obviously this provoked enormous outrage from animal welfare and animal welfare charities. There are ongoing cold sow issues associated with the coronavirus, and certainly in Ireland these relate still to tonnies in Germany. And when you see the figures, it's quite incredible. From Belgium and the Netherlands, 60,000 sows go every week to Germany for processing. And in Ireland, almost half of our cold sows go to tonnies for processing. The UK had a double whammy of Brexit and COVID, and there's a huge reduction in cold sow value. And all of this is still causing, certainly in Ireland at least, a backlog of cold sows on farms. So many years ago, I documented poor welfare of cold sows, and in more recent years, Meta Herskin and colleagues in Aarhus have done some work with cold sows, and we know these animals having low value under normal circumstances even are very susceptible to poor welfare and deterioration in their welfare, both on the farm, but especially from the point of departure to the farm until arrival at the slaughter plant. So this is an ongoing concern for the welfare of these animals. Finally, we go to the threat to the environment caused by pollution, and any time carcasses are disposed of, it poses a pollution risk because of the leaching of bodily fluids, chemicals into the environment, and also hazardous gases and the potential for air surface and groundwater contamination. Obviously, it will depend on the disposal method. Where you have unlined burial and composting, as is allowed in the US, not in the EU, the risks are higher. In the EU, if this occurs, it has to be done using lined methods. This picture shows the mink in Denmark, but we know then the problem was that they had to be exhumed and incinerated. And indeed, incineration and rendering is probably a preferred option, but it's very energy costly and does release greenhouse. Areas where pig and poultry industries are concentrated already carry a burden of pollution, so the disposal of carcasses can cause a new stream of pollution in these areas. For example, the runoff from dead chicken compost is very high in phosphorus, much higher in fact than the phosphorus content of manure. Burial of animals causes risks to wildlife. Milk actually has a very high biochemical oxygen demand, so it poses a risk to the environment. And another maybe less obvious issue is in the US, some dairy producers were advised to cull more animals, and we know that involuntary culling is associated with an increase in. In our paper, we also outlined some short-term solutions. So relating to production, there's definitely a need for research on alternative methods of mass euthanasia and disposal of animals. Mobile incineration units could help dispose of animals under such situations. At the processing level, processors could open for longer, I suppose, and you'll get a huge increase in processing capacity, but this isn't really a sustainable option. Local or mobile abattoirs are promising. There's been a huge reduction in local or smaller abattoirs. We know the industry has become hugely centralized, and a lot of it is because of really burgeoning food safety requirements, and the cost of implementing them for small-scale abattoirs is really not sustainable. But we know that these local or mobile abattoirs do offer welfare benefits, and this paper outlined improvements in meat quality and to stress levels in lambs being slaughtered in a mobile. So other short-term solutions are at the level of retail. There was an increase in direct-to-consumer retail models, so sale of food at farmers' markets, sale of slow food or local produce, but obviously this would only have a small impact. In terms of consumption, some of the initial changes would indicate welfare benefits. There was an increase in home prepared meals, which is good for the welfare of humans. And there was an increase in plant-based meat alternatives. I realize this is controversial, but such products are associated perhaps with lower greenhouse gas emissions, but on the other hand are also highly processed and therefore perhaps not the best for human beings. A better diet is possibly one that is high in unprocessed plant-based foods, but also involves some meats, such as, for example, the Mediterranean diet. And this would have a lower environmental footprint, and there's lots of evidence to show that it's much healthier for human beings. In the long term, though, obviously, there has to be policy change, and we've seen how Germany has reacted to the enormous upheaval caused by the COVID outbreaks in their meat slaughter plants, such that they are committed to reforming the meat industry. Sustainable intensification is being talked about a lot, and there's a lot of people here that would know a lot more about it than me, but it does seem imperative on us that we need to start re-evaluating how we produce livestock. Moderating our demand for animal products, as I've alluded to in the last slide, would seem to be part of this, and Colin Sage has written about sustainable consumption. Reducing food waste is obviously another hugely important component of this. There is an increase in alternative production systems, and it would seem that the UN Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the EU's Farm to Fork strategy, which requires a fair, healthy and environmentally friendly food system, is looking for alternative production systems. Regenerative agriculture is growing in popularity, and this is the title of a book, Farm Girls Search for the Promise of Regenerative Agriculture. But as she concedes, one size fits none, and the solution is likely going to have to come from a range of areas. Silvopastoral systems offer high biodiversity and good animal welfare for animals, and these authors talked about how they provide efficient feed conversion, enhanced connectivity between habitat patches, as well as animal welfare, and therefore they truly meet the One Welfare requirements. But on the extreme, then you can have very high-tech production systems, such as this is the Kipster farm, and they are able to produce very profitable eggs under a very profitable business model, but it's also a carbon neutral model, so environmentally friendly. And the farm has won awards from Compassion World Farming and Eurogroup for Animals for the high standards of animal welfare. So this system also quite different from silvopastoral, but also offers huge One Welfare. So what you've seen in the past few slides are all the One Welfare problems that this pandemic has created. And our thesis is that we therefore need a One Welfare solution. And animal welfare should probably be central to any One Welfare solution, because it's our connection to other animals, as we talked about throughout this presentation, that really inspires our concerns and connection to the environment. Animal welfare, because it is central to animal health, is a very powerful preventative medicine, and this is very important in an era of antimicrobial resistance. Also, improving animal welfare can mitigate greenhouse gas emissions, and probably even better than breeding strategies, and without the potential cost to animal welfare that some breeding strategies can bring. So indeed, farm animal welfare is a central component of sustainability. While COVID-19 raised a myriad of One Welfare concerns, it really has highlighted the fragility of our food systems, and it's also provided us with a unique opportunity for radical change, whereby we can build resilience and ensure food security in the face of future challenges. And a One Welfare-driven transformation of livestock production will ensure a safer, fairer and healthier environment. So I'd just like to thank you very much and draw your attention to two conferences. They're actually happening on either side of the EEAP conference this year. The first is the WAFL, the Welfare of Animals at Farm and Group level, and the second in mid-September is the One Welfare World Conference. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Laura, for a very comprehensive view of the impacts the pandemic can have on animals, environment, and also human welfare. I think your One Welfare approach sheds a very different light on the way we see things, because, for example, in the media, a lot of attention has been given to what has happened with livestock and with the environment. They have focused on the consequences of emergency killings and so on. But I think very little attention has been given to the psychological toll it can have on the human welfare as well. So it's certainly a very interesting angle to view things. You have offered several, outlined several solutions to tackle this issue, both at the production, the consumption, and the processing and the consumption level. But well, some of the things you have presented have mostly affected very intensified livestock farming systems. Do you think it's realistic, or it can be cost effective for them to scale back to systems that can be more adaptive in these conditions?
Yeah, that's the $60 million question, Isabel. You know, I mean, do we run two models, you know, like the Kipster farm there, or have pigs out in agroforestry settings and supply a stream of high value, high welfare value meat through that stream, and then still have thousands of pigs going through the intensive model with all the problems of lack of resilience and everything that has. And I just don't know if I've got an answer to that, because there's still such a demand for cheap food, I suppose. And those of us with the luxury of spending more may choose this high welfare, you know, to source our food from the high welfare systems. But that still doesn't solve the problem for everyone else who wants to eat meat. But I think, yeah, so I just don't know though about the sustainability of these intensive systems. And while we can employ all the tech in the world to help us manage them better, you know, really, they just don't have the resilience, it seems, to these shocks. And the previous speakers have talked about how they are inevitably going to increase, and we're going to have more of them. So it's not going to be easy, but I think there has to be more resilience built into those intensive models as well as developing completely alternative systems. I mean, I really don't know the exact solution to it, but I think we all have to get our heads together and try and find one.
Yeah, we've got to find the pathway, certainly. Yeah. We have one question from the audience from Jan Ledoux, and he says, to be less than welfare friendly, how can we encourage more local investment in processing capacity to overcome some of these welfare problems?
Yeah, I mean, this is an area, I've just finished developing a project on alternative pig production systems and trying to create another production stream in Ireland, and talking to people in the industry. They're saying brilliant, and the government is offering money to develop these, but where are we going to kill our pigs? And I've spoken to some butchers, and they're just exasperated about the amount of legislation and requirements and financial requirements that are being continuously placed in them. So they're saying, you know, the farm to fork and all these strategies are advocating that we have more local produce, but unless there's a huge drive in policy change, you know, I mean, I don't know what some of the people I've spoken to have talked about is that the requirements are developed for intensive and large scale processing, whatever, and that there needs to be a separate set. And I don't think, you know, that I think, again, going back to the one size fits none, you can't apply that same set of conditions onto a smaller local abattoir. They still obviously have to meet all the food safety requirements and that, but there must be a way of ameliorating some of those requirements that are really all have been developed for the large scale processing industries. And I think that would be one step, but like certainly everything will fail, I think, if we don't redress the continuing closure of local abattoirs, because we're at nothing with our development of alternative systems and everything if there's nowhere to kill the animals locally.
Do you see an opportunity here? Sorry. Do you see an opportunity here for, I don't know, for reviewing the very strict rules that these local abattoirs have to comply with?
Yeah, well, that's exactly, I guess, what I'm saying, Isabel, you know, and maybe there has to be, you know, there's a need for some new research in this area. Again, just a very recent conversation with a small processor here who is killing pigs for a lot of these high welfare systems. And he was saying that his cull sow carcasses have to be below a certain temperature before he can put them on the truck to be transported to Germany. But he said like the new refrigerated trucks can bring down the temperature very quickly. And there's been that requirement was based on very old research, for trucks that, they're so high tech now and their refrigeration capacities are so high. So there's research gaps there as well, for sure, which will need to inform then maybe the development of a new set of guidelines for small processors and small butchers.
Mm-hmm. That opens a whole new area of research. Yeah, certainly.
Yeah.
So we will move now to the next presentation. Thank you very much, Laura.
Thank you.
Now we will have the presentation by Mike Lee. Michael is an expert in sustainable livestock production, focusing on highlighting the role in human and planetary health. He has a background in animal nutrition and has worked in several institutes and universities like Aberystwyth or the University of Bristol, and only recently he has moved to Harper Adams University. He has published a large number of articles, including very recent ones in Nature and Science. And for his services to animal science, Michael was awarded the Sir John Hammond Memorial Prize by the British Society of Animal Science, where he is currently vice president and will soon take the presidency next April. He is also a very active EAP member, where he is president of our Livestock Farming Systems Commission. And today, Michael will analyze the impact of COVID-19 on the food supply and on sustainable livestock systems. So.
My name is Michael Lee, and I am Deputy Vice Chancellor at Harper Adams University. The European Federation of Animal Science has asked me to talk about COVID-19's impact on the food supply chain and aspects of sustainable livestock systems. As we're all aware, there have been many global challenges which require scientific solutions, not just COVID-19. For example, we need to concentrate on how we improve our diets. The diets that we consume have had major impacts on the health of all nations, and therefore we need to consider the role of diet in human health and make sure that the food that we grow and raise is delivering to human health. We also need to tackle farm incomes and ensure that farms are resilient and robust and economically viable, and delivering the future food systems that will drive health. We have lots of pressure on land. We wish to protect biodiversity. We do not want agricultural encroachment into rich biodiverse lands like the Amazon, the steppes and the Pampinas. And at the same time, we have a world growing human population. So how are we going to feed more people with the same amount of agricultural land? So therefore, we have to farm more efficiently and utilize land more appropriately, with growing pressures, not just for food, but recreational use and also for energy and fiber. Climate change. We don't even have status quo. The type of systems that we have now and the agriculture we have now is not the agriculture we're going to need or have in 10 to 15 years' time. So we need to consider the robust sort of agriculture that will deliver food systems in a very variable climate. We need to wean ourselves off chemicals and high impact inputs and look at more a circular economy and an agroecological or biological approach of farming, and wean ourselves off chemical agriculture. And then, of course, COVID-19 has had huge impacts on the food system and all our lives. So none of these things can be tackled in isolation. They must be tackled together, and they all need scientific solutions. Particularly if we consider COVID-19 and the impact it's had on the food sector. ways that we can work around looking at a future food system is that we need to develop a roadmap of support across the food supply sector, all the way from primary production on farm to the consumer at home. How we consume and access our food has changed during COVID-19, possibly forever. And also how we grow food and raise animals has changed. Access to labour, particularly international recruitment, has changed during the pandemic, and that may never return to how it was before. So what we produce and how we supply it needs to change. And opportunities may align with national food strategies, which will link food to health. And we need to consider the food that we produce as the health industry to drive human health, to make us more robust to the challenges of the next unfortunate pandemic that may hit us, and therefore ensure that we're in a better position to be able to tackle that. I think COVID-19 has really shown that a refocus on obesity and metabolic syndrome driven by poor diet, as these have led to increased risk of death and poor health associated with COVID-19. So what are the shocks that COVID-19 has applied to the food system? Well, it's across many areas, from food production, food processing, food retailers, and also the consumer. So what I want to look now at each of these and consider some of the challenges that COVID-19 has applied and some of the solutions. First of all, in terms of food production, well, one of the major challenges associated with our farming industries is access to labour. The closure of borders during the pandemic has reduced international workforces on farms. Farms are usually rely heavily on this international labour force, and so that has changed the way that farmers are going to develop in the future. For example, fluctuating demand for milk has led to dumping of milk by farmers. So for example, the aeronautics industry, which required milk supply from a particular producer because they were no longer flying, then they closed the requirement for that milk production. And therefore anyone who's in that supply chain had no way to sell their milk, and the only way that you could get rid of it was to dump it. So we need more resilient supply chains. Increasing demand and order variability from retailers resulted in the meat industry having carcass imbalances and diminishing revenues. There was risk to global supply continuity for critical inputs for feed, supplements, and medicine vaccinations, the supply of those from all around the world. There's increased scrutiny in how food is produced and wider issues of sustainability in what we eat. Consumers will start to look at their health and understanding how that's related to the food that they consume. So how has food producers, how have farmers responded? Well, we need to have investment in precision agriculture, improving efficiency and net zero. As we look at COVID-19, we can consider One Health approaches when we think of how we're going to improve our food systems. Digitalization and data management to support supply chains. There's been a growing need and realization that we need to test the resilience of food systems within virtual worlds. So applying how different farming methodologies can be used on a virtual farm before we apply it to the real world. And this will test the resilience of different interventions and the impact it will have on the supply of healthy food. Agricultural engineering needs to work to improve the sector, new ways of farming, as we're going to have reduced access to international labour forces. A greater understanding of the healthiness of food has also triggered growing interest in sustainability assessment on farm, farming for health, not just for healthy food, but a healthy environment. All of these need to be considered in the new way of building back stronger our agricultural industry following COVID-19. We need to prepare and influence delivery of national agricultural policy to ensure that we embed resilience in producing high quality food that is at one with human and planetary health. And to support this, we need to give farmers the tools to be able to access how resilient and sustainable their farms are. For example, really good carbon toolkits and biodiversity assessment on farm. So actually, when farmers are looking at how they improve their systems, they have the methodology to determine where they're benchmarking and where their baseline is. In terms of food processing and the meat sector challenges, well, there are huge challenges associated with the meat industry, particularly during meat processing, because social distancing guidelines are unpragmatic in those particular close working environments, for example, on the slaughter line. Conditions in these conditions in these environments were highly suitable for viral transfer, and there often were high COVID-19 hotspots associated with meat processing because of the environment, cold and humid. A sudden fluctuation in demand has resulted in beef carcass imbalance in many supply chains, leading to a significant pile-up of high-value hindquarters of meat, which are usually destined for the food service sector. Most inspection records and documents are handled manually by workers, for example, kill sheets, and this increased the risk of viral transmission between close working colleagues. And cold storage operating at full capacity with devalued frozen and prime cuts because of this stockpiling, which had huge impacts on the resilience of the meat supply chain. And there was also a reduction in the conventional workforce capacity, as I've already indicated previously, in association to national and international workforces. How has the sector responded? Well, there's been a clear policy in most countries around scaling back on meat imports at a time when national meat industries are facing carcass imbalance due to demand fluctuation, particularly a focus within the UK. There's been improved supply chain resilience through investment in value chains, brand development and online presence with links through to retail. There's been job opportunities for local willing workforces and also setting up alternative distribution channels, home delivery logistics, to mitigate the inefficiencies of the predominant buyer-driven model. And I've got an example here of some meat box schemes produced by local butchers for local sales or home delivery in different villages and towns. In terms of food retailers, the challenges, well, lockdown has put considerable pressure on meat and dairy markets, which resulted in unsustainable market prices and rapid changes in food distribution systems. But actually it was the view rather than the actual what was happening within the industry which caused these stockpiles. News and viral videos of empty supermarket shelves influenced consumer confidence in food supply systems, resulting in stockpiling and changing people's buying behaviour. Waiting time for online deliveries were a major issue for many, and lack of key ingredients for home cooking during lockdown. Interest in sustainable options, however, rose during this, and there was a huge increase in buying local. How did retailers respond? Well, they addressed ways that consumers wish to shop, in store and online, so that shoppers felt safe. There was a huge shift to online purchasing, but also the types of foods purchased. More time to cook, so therefore people changed the type of foods that they were buying and spent more time cooking them and spending at home because of lockdown. But this was not just related to COVID-19 concerns. Other issues around sustainability rose also. There was a greater realization about what they purchased and how it impacts on the environment. Investment in online presence and sustainability assessment schemes has been rising within food retailers and also local food boxes and house deliveries. Huge increases on online presence, for example, Ocado and also Amazon Food. How did the consumers change? Well, clear change in how consumers purchase and access food. Clearly, consumers have changed. Linked to the types of food they wish to purchase and also time taken to prepare and enjoy the food. And this may have changed for good. There's been a greater focus on other issues related to food, particularly sustainability and animal welfare, as consumers become more switched on to the type of food they're buying online. COVID-19's greater impact on the obese and poor health population has given a new focus on healthy eating. And it's important to tackle the cheap food paradox, i.e. that the foods that are least healthy are often the foods that are cheaper to buy and easier to access. And foods that are grown with a more sustainability focus and are healthier are often more expensive and more difficult to access. So it's vital that the correct information is disseminated critically about the role of livestock and products that drive human health. And there's been a rise in veganism and flexitarianism. And therefore we need to be clear about the key role that livestock can play in a healthy, balanced diet and the role of an omnivorous diet in delivering human and planetary health, but also be aware of the impacts and challenges of overeating, whether that be a plant-based diet or an omnivorous diet. So we need to be clear of how the livestock sector is going to respond in light of COVID-19 with a focus on health. And therefore, when we talk about livestock products, we need to be talking about their nutritional value versus their environmental footprint. Moving away from comparing livestock products just as a weight and think about the nutrients they contain. So move away from carbon dioxide equivalents per kilogram of product and move towards carbon dioxide equivalents per percentage recommended daily intake of key nutrients that different livestock products contain. And that's what's shown in this slide here. We have the main nutrients on the left-hand side associated to why livestock products are part of an Eat Well plate. The recommended daily intake, the RDI of those key nutrients, proteins, micronutrients, long-chain fatty acids, and then the proportion of these nutrients that different livestock products will give on in a 100-gram serving. And when we compare the environmental footprint of these products based on their nutritional value, some of the rankings that we have considered previously, for example, between chicken and beef, change over. So that you actually have a lower environmental footprint for beef because of its high nutrient density. And when we consider the environmental role and the environmental impact of livestock, we need to include their nutritional value. So sustainability is complex, and if we're thinking about livestock systems, we need to ensure that we deliver all three pillars of sustainability. So producing products, animal-based products that deliver human health, that provide robust businesses which are going to ensure the future generation of farmers coming through into the industry, and also that we're the first generation that leaves this planet in a better state than we have found it. So therefore, we're reducing emissions and producing food in an environmentally friendly way. And central to all these three pillars is health, whether that be soil, plant, animal, and human. COVID-19 has been one external shock to the agriculture and livestock sector, but there are many others. Social change. We are changing the way we think about our food, what we consume, and what we want from our food. There's been many changes in different eating practices, flexitarianism, veganism, and therefore we need to consider how food systems will deliver health. Injustice. There's huge injustice within country and across the world in terms of access to food, rising poverty, people not having the control of their finances to make the correct purchase decisions. This cheap food paradox needs to be addressed so that healthy food is available to all, and informed choices around the benefits of a healthy, balanced, omnivorous diet needs to be clear and accessible. International trade, particularly within the UK, as we've left the European Union, how we interact with other countries and organisations around a just transfer of food systems. Urbanisation. As countries get richer, people move from rural communities and into cities. And when they do, they consume differently. They consume more, and they have this nutrition transition with greater demand for readily available foods. And again, they change the way that they actually eat, purchase, and the type of foods that they consume, which has huge pressures on human and planetary health. And of course, I've already mentioned climate change. The agriculture we have now may not be the agriculture we need in 10, 15 years' time. So central to all this is how farming systems will respond, and they cannot be tackled independently. They need to be tackled in concert, collectively, working together. My last slide is just an exemplar of a collaboration to show how organisations and countries can work together to find answers to more sustainable livestock systems, and in particularly in this case the Global Farm Platform, sustainable ruminant livestock systems. And working together, thinking of how different ways of raising livestock in different ecoclimates can contribute to a sustainable food system, so we can tackle challenges such as COVID-19. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michael. It has been a very, very interesting talk in which you have demonstrated the very multifaceted aspects of the shocks COVID has meant for agriculture. You have presented the different challenges for producers, retailers, consumers, and different solutions to this challenge, which is obviously not the only one that the livestock sector is facing. As you said, there's social change, climate change, and many other aspects that are also affecting the sector. You presented different systems that responded in a different manner. Who do you think were the best prepared? Who were in the best position to respond? Apparently, there are some small scale operators which have a good level of organization that enables them to connect the different stakeholders of the supply chain and reach the market. Where do you think lies the success of the adaptation to a situation like this one?
Yes, thank you, Isabel. I actually found the retail chain responded extremely well. I presented in the slide, that there was issues with stockpiling, but often that was just driven by incorrect information, driven by the media, that there was going to be food shortages. So people went out and bought more, and that's what caused the issues. but actually the retailers and the supply chains themselves dealt with it extremely well, and dealt with how consumers changed very quickly. You know, this greater realization of how consumers were changing what they consumed. You know, retailers know an awful lot about us due to our purchase decisions, whether we're using credit cards or we're using online, and they're making very quick decisions about what we want. You know, the rise in Ocado and the rise of Amazon Food, for example, who can make decisions and suggestions about what you want to purchase before you even know what you want to purchase. So they responded to it extremely well in a way of changing their business models. And that will never go back. Those changes are here now. And people who have moved onto online shopping, you know, a proportion of them will move back, but not everybody will move back. Still, a vast amount will still stay online. So I think the retailers have responded extremely well to it in that sector. There have been challenges with local production chains and access. There has been a growing interest in how food is produced and buying local. But still at the same time, you know, you've got this other side of saying, I like to buy local, but actually buying all my food online is really accessible and easy, even if it isn't local. So you've got these two mixed churches that have been growing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, we have different niches that we can target. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We have one question from the audience from Professor Giovanni Vitante. He says, what do you think about the increased confidence in science as a consequence of pandemia? Could this also be true for animal science?
Yeah, great question, Giovanni. Yeah, there's been obviously, as science has delivered the vaccine, you know, there's been increased view that, you know, that the public's in safe hands with our scientific community. But also in terms of livestock, and I think Laura emphasized extremely well in her presentation about zoonotic risks and the way that humans interacted with animals, dumping their pets when they thought actually there could be this transmission risk. And there was the anti-livestock brigade were very quick to try and show a risk of COVID-19 associated with livestock and the meat processors. I think the livestock industry as a whole has dealt with that extremely well, has been very open and transparent with the issues. The data, again, which Christiane and Laura presented, have shown, you know, some of the issues and risks associated with zoonotic diseases, but actually, you know, what that low risk associated with humans. I think there's been this greater realization and understanding about epidemiology and, you know, and transmission and changes within viruses. So I actually think, you know, there's been a lot of good information that's been put out, and I think the public are more informed. And so even though obviously COVID-19 has had catastrophic impact on so many families, I really feel that for the next pandemic, and there will be a next pandemic, unfortunately, hopefully everyone's more in tune with what needs to be done, and hopefully governments are more in tune with what needs to be done to support the scientific community, because I think the public is very much aware of the investment that was needed in science to deliver a solution. And if that investment wasn't there in science, what a big mess we would be in now.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. We have some other questions here. One is from Luciano Pinotti. He says, in your presentation, you mentioned an anti-livestock agenda. Can you develop a bit more about it? And do you think that COVID-19 has accelerated this agenda?
Yeah, I do, unfortunately, because there has been this view about what's been driving ill health and metabolic syndrome, and this view that plant-based solutions will always be environmentally benign and healthier than livestock alternatives. But of course, that's not true. And Laura showed very well, you know, the healthy Mediterranean diet. So it's all about balance and the role that livestock play in healthy diets. And that's what I was trying to emphasize in my slide. And I don't think I did it particularly well. I don't like pre-recordings, as I've mentioned to Andrea before, but, you know, the fact that when you think about livestock in terms of the key nutrients it provides, where it sits in an Eat Well plate, and working with national food strategies to actually get the true evidence around the vital roles that livestock play, particularly dairy in terms of calcium levels, but also meat in terms of bioavailable iron and vitamin B12. But of course, it's got to be in moderation. And I think the anti-livestock brigade have been so quick to draw lines and conclusions around bad health, livestock, and COVID-19. And of course, those correlations are not necessarily there, but if you eat badly, you often overconsume livestock products. But of course, you can eat well and eat livestock products.
Thank you. We have one question here concerning health, which can be maybe answered by Christiane. It says that health was mentioned to be central. So do you think we have enough of an idea of the disease burden in our livestock, nationally and individually on farm, to be able to efficiently tackle these often endemic diseases in order to increase health and welfare and ultimately the sustainability of farming?
I think yes, we do know pretty well what is the shape of the health of our livestock, and I think we can say in Europe in general that we do have a very possibly the most efficient system of livestock health that does exist on Earth. The problem is, or the fact is, that there will be always new challenges, and that we need always to readapt ourselves to new environments, new circumstances. And as animal production systems change, and possibly now there is a kind of trend towards more open air, more extensive, more animal welfare friendly, and so production. This is very good from several aspects. But from the health aspect, it's not always the most easy way to tackle diseases, particularly when you are thinking of things like tuberculosis in many animals, African swine fever and others in pigs, maybe even salmonella or avian flu in birds. Those are a bit more challenging to tackle in more extensive systems. So it is not a problem, but it is something that we continuously need to adapt to and to think of. That's all.
Yeah, thanks very much, Christiane. We have a couple of questions by Phil Gansworthy. I think they are addressed to Michael. One is about the cheap food paradox. He says that it's valid, but how can you overcome it for people who use food banks? And the other concerns also, how can the milk production chain be resilient when it has problems like losing the airline market and there's a little margin? So resilient may cause quite important economic problems.
Yeah, thank you, Phil. And I think I can tackle both those questions together because I think they do align. Yes, you're right. The cheap food paradox is very complicated to resolve, but it needs to be. And that needs government and it needs policy. Because there are many people in society who have not got the control of their finances and can make the correct decisions. And so therefore there needs to be support in making sure that food is accessible to those individuals. And that really needs good political intervention. In terms of resilience within the dairy sector, yeah, totally agree. Again, you know, there is major challenges if you are a provider for the airline industry and no planes are flying. What happens to your milk if there's no one that's going to process it into those little plastic tubs? So what happens then? Well, first of all, we shouldn't have those little plastic tubs if we're thinking about sustainability. But we've got to have resilience within the wider component of redirecting food for where it's needed. You just mentioned, Philip, within your question about food banks, you know, dumping gallons of high quality nutritional milk because actually the one purchaser who was aligned to that system no longer needed it is not a responsible use of that food. So therefore, there's got to be mechanisms put in place which can capture and support farmers to redirect that. That's complicated. That needs economics and systems resilience analysts to determine that. And that's why I mentioned about this virtual world, trying the resilience of different food chains with different perturbations. So testing how resilient a dairy production system can be when you close off one particular market, and making sure then there is a mechanism or transfer of those nutrients into a different market. So it's that sort of wider assessment that needs to be included. And the major advancements within the retail sector that are doing this already, Ocado, for example, are doing this. They're understanding how food demands and when food gets to a certain point in terms of sell-by date, it goes into food baskets and into supporting people within who can't access food into food markets. So yeah, in some way that we need better resilience and ability to test within the virtual world before applying into the real world. Food banks, that was the word I was after. Sorry, Phil.
We have a question here that maybe can be answered from any of you three. It's from Roger Laurent, and it says the repartition of the added value in the whole chain, and especially at the farm level. How can sustainability, health, and the environment be better paid and recognized at the EU level for the local supply instead of global supply? And consider, as all the consumers are, and how to consider it, because all consumers are now concerned with these issues. So who takes the lead here? Any of you wants to answer this question? Laura?
I don't know. I was trying to fully understand it. Is it about how do we get people to pay more for food, or yeah, like this is the fundamental problem. You know, the cheap food model. We wouldn't have this small profit margins on milk and the lack of resilience there because of it if people were prepared to pay more for quality. I mean, maybe it's a bit of a utopian notion that people, you know, we've created this dependence on cheap food so that we can have so much more of our income to spend on all the other products and goods and phones and cars that drive an economy, and food doesn't drive an economy, I suppose. So it's in everyone's national interest to keep that as a small portion of the consumer's expenditure. But yet the costs are enormous that we're paying to have the luxury of cheap food so we can spend money on all the other things that drive an economy. So like, it seems to me that it requires, you know, enormous political change or policy change, because we've created a dependence amongst people on paying very little for their food, and now we're expecting them to pay. And they've believed, I think, that food was it was a given that it was animal welfare friendly. It was a given that it was healthy. I think consumers just expected that, you know, and they didn't realize, and they don't realize that for farmers, it was impossible to meet all those demands when the margin was shrinking, you know, year on year. So there's a huge conundrum there that I don't know how we're going to solve, but I do think it takes enormous political change, radical change and policy change. And maybe I'm being naive even in saying that, but you know, we always get it thrown back to us when you ask a consumer, will they pay more for higher welfare? You know, I want the animals' welfare to be good. I want the environment, but will you pay more? Well, maybe not. And we hold them responsible then. It's your fault. But they've just assumed that all of that is a given when they buy their produce. And it hasn't. It's been eroded and eroded away. And I just think, for all of us, we have to reevaluate what we spend our money on, and
you know, that our health and the health of our children are at risk if we don't prepare to spend more. But I don't think it's enough. I think it has to be supported by policy. I don't know if that makes sense, but they're my thoughts on it.
Yeah, there's been a lot of discussion around, you know, I agree with everything Laura said. You know, it is extremely complicated, but, you know, the true cost accounting of food. So the view that the polluter pays. So if you're producing food that pollutes, then you pay for the cleanup. You pay for water quality improvement. You pay for greenhouse gas emissions and carbon capture. Of course, that needs to be part of an equitable supply chain. And of course, then the consumer needs to pick up that bill if they want those products that are more environmentally damaging. But also aligned to environmental health, you've got human health. So if you eat inappropriately, you consume inappropriately, you will burden the health system. And that will have a cost associated with it. So you could extrapolate true cost accounting for the impact of human and planetary health. And that would naturally make polluting foods and unhealthy foods more costly. And hopefully then, by definition, healthier foods and least polluting foods will be less costly. So that's all part of a changing paradigm associated with it. But we need to also be extremely fair about how foods are produced within the environ of a farm. So actually not just demonize a production system, say, for example, milk production, because you've got enteric fermentation of the cow, but actually think about what that cow is also doing in the part of the wider farm. So if that farm has hedgerows, trees, high investment in soil quality, then that is rewarded for the farmer, not just the detriments of the enteric fermentation. If that dairy is using byproducts and recycling industrial waste streams that would never otherwise be lost or not be used for producing high quality nutrition, then that farmer is also rewarded for that. So there's many of these different aspects that we need to consider within a new, healthier food system for both human and planetary. But we need good politicians.
Yeah, bottom line.
Not just good scientists.
We have a question here concerning the direction research should take. In this case, they are asking about if it should be active in the value chain and the correct payment of farmers. But I would like to broaden this question to all of you and have a final remark from your part on where should research in your field be addressed so that it can better tackle the possible consequences we can have, not only from this pandemic, but from other challenges that livestock the livestock sector is facing. So can we start with, well, in the order you have presented, for example, Christiane, maybe?
Fine. So I think, I mean, there are, of course, many challenges regarding animal health and in the field of animal science and after the COVID crisis or during the COVID crisis. But I think there are 2 points that are very important and that are already reflected somehow in the new calls in the European programs and also in the national ones. One of them is the switch from using more antibiotics towards using alternatives to antibiotics. This goes from the prebiotics to the probiotics to the postbiotics and all the other options that there are essentially to improve the immune system instead of fighting against the bugs themselves. So that's one area, including the use of the knowledge on the microbiota in this regard. And then the other very large field where there is a lot of things to do still, although we are building on good and on sound existing knowledge, is the field of biosafety in a very broad sense. Not just the interaction between wildlife and domestic animals or between different herds or different species of domestic animals, but also the broader sense of biosafety that may include vectors, that may include airborne risks, waterborne risks, slurry-borne risks, all these kind of things. So I think these two fields regarding animal health are probably expecting some growth in the next years.
Thanks very much, Christian. And concerning welfare, Laura?
Well, following on from something Christian said there, where he mentioned, you know, we've got to look at, instead of tackling the bugs, get the immune system working and animal health, and he listed a whole, and I would add animal welfare to that, because there's only some very recent few studies showing how, say, keeping pigs in a high welfare environment has beneficial effects when you challenge them with disease, for example. And you see, and like, it's just, so I would say that animal welfare, going even further back, is one of the key ways of improving animal health and reducing antimicrobial usage and the threat of antimicrobial resistance. But I would definitely say, and because following on from my One Welfare advocacy of One Welfare, I should say, that I think we all have to start working better together. In, you know, we all talk about projects, they're multidisciplinary, but do we really, you know, work together to create more than what we would do individually in a kind of a transdisciplinary fashion? And I think that evaluating any system now, or any management, or any, is pointless unless we do it holistically and include all actors in the chain, the animal, the environment, the human. There's no point in going out and evaluating a grazing strategy unless you make sure, for example, that it's good for the environment, the animal won't suffer, or whatever. And I think that kind of holistic approach is what I would advocate in all our research going forward to ensure sustainability. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Laura. I see no other way either. Michael?
Yeah, totally agree with both Christian and Laura, you know, particularly the importance of multidisciplinary research and cross-boundary research. You know, pandemics, greenhouse gas, and everything that's affecting our global planet doesn't recognize these little anthropogenic lines on a map called countries. You know, they're just something that we've made up. But the future of the planet, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to ensure that we can be better positioned for the next global pandemic, will rely on collaboration and multidisciplinary research. I really like Laura's One Welfare, you know, but it's driven from One Health. You know, we've got to consider, you know, human, planetary, and livestock disease. And I think what COVID-19 has really done, it is putting into everybody's viewpoint how susceptible humans are to disease, and how we are not just the complete controls of our destiny, that actually biology has a way of smacking us in the face if we don't give it due respect. And therefore an understanding about livestock systems, biodiversity. You know, Christian mentioned about the pangenomic response, about greater understanding of human health and the role that microbes have within our gut, but also the interactions that we have within livestock systems as part of a biological system and biodiversity, and how our food system ties in with that. So I really do like the idea of circular economies. And if you do like the idea of a circular economy in terms of sustainability, you've got to respect and understand the importance of livestock, because they're a critical component of that. But also, I think Laura picked it up right at the start, which is the vital role of companion animals. And we mustn't forget that. You know, although it's really distressing and hard to hear that people were throwing their pets out during the pandemic, but so many people relied on their pets during lockdown. And so I think we've got a greater understanding the importance of the interaction between humans and animals, whether they be companion animals, livestock, or wildlife.
Hear, hear.
So thanks very much to the three of you, and also to Martin, who isn't with us anymore, because you have presented very diverse topics. You've had a very interesting conversation about the impacts we can see of this or of any pandemic on our livestock sector. And it's clear that we will have to deal with uncertainty in the future, but that science, both basic and applied science, will be there to help provide solutions to anything that the livestock sector may face. It's obvious that we will have to target system resilience, sometimes adaptability, or even transformability for some situations. But I think what you have presented today will help attain these objectives in the many different livestock farming systems that we have in Europe and beyond. So thank you very much to all of you for your availability and the very enlightening presentations that you've done today. And thanks very much also to all our audience for being there. I remind you that you will soon receive a questionnaire for gathering your opinions about how this seminar went and what we can do in the future with this new EEAP webinar series. And I'd like to remind you that we have our following webinar next 31st of March. I don't know if I'm sharing my screen, sorry. Can't you see the program of the webinar, of the
Yes,
webinar?
we can see it.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, I was lost. I didn't know which screen I was on. So thanks very much to you all, and hopefully see you at the end of this month in our next webinar. So
thank you.
We will close here. Thanks very much.
Bye. Thanks.
Thanks, Isabel. Thanks, EAP.
Yes, thanks a million. Bye-bye.